The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Redemption Creek, a small settlement nestled between the rugged mountains and sprawling plains of Wyoming Territory. Jeremiah Blackwood sat atop his dapple gray stallion, scanning the town with eyes that had seen too much death and betrayal in their 45 years. His weathered face, framed by a week-old beard and topped with salt and pepper hair, betrayed nothing of the storm raging within him. The leather holster at his hip held a Colt Peacemaker that had taken more lives than he cared to remember, and the Winchester rifle secured to his saddle had become an extension of himself during the 15 years he'd spent as an outlaw. Wanted posters bearing his likeness hung in sheriff's offices across 3 territories, offering $5,000 for his capture, dead or alive. If you're enjoying this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions in the comments. Which city are you watching from? I'd love to know. As Jeremiah guided his horse down the main street, the townsfolk stepped aside, mothers pulling their children close, and men averting their gaze. His reputation preceded him, the notorious leader of the Blackwood Gang, responsible for a string of bank robberies from Colorado to Montana. But what the wanted posters didn't tell was how he'd come to this life after returning from the Civil War, to find his family's ranch burned to ashes and his young wife and son murdered by land grabbers. That day, something had broken inside him, something that could never be fixed. He'd sworn off love forever, dedicating his life instead to revenge and survival in a lawless land that took everything he'd ever cared about. The saloon doors swung open as Jeremiah dismounted, tying his horse to the hitching post with practiced efficiency. The piano music faltered momentarily as he entered, the patrons falling silent before resuming their conversations in hushed tones. The notorious outlaw ignored them all, making his way to the bar where he ordered whiskey, tossing coins onto the worn wooden surface. "Keep it coming," he muttered to the barkeep, a heavy-set man with nervous eyes, who nodded quickly and left the bottle. Jeremiah had come to Redemption Creek for one reason: to meet with his remaining gang members and plan their next job. The railroad payroll would be passing through in 3 days, and after that score, he planned to head south to Mexico, leaving behind the ghosts that had haunted him across the frontier. What Jeremiah couldn't have known as he nursed his whiskey was that fate had other plans. The saloon door swung open again, admitting a slender woman with copper hair that caught the lamplight like a sunset over the mountains. Eleanor Montgomery moved with quiet confidence through the rough establishment, ignoring the appreciative glances and crude comments from the miners and cowboys scattered throughout the room. She wore a dark green dress that spoke of Eastern refinement, though it was evident she'd adapted to frontier life. As the town's only schoolteacher and the daughter of the recently deceased doctor, she commanded a respect unusual for a woman alone in the territories. Eleanor's green eyes swept across the room until they landed on Jeremiah, recognition flickering across her features. Not the recognition of a notorious outlaw, something deeper, more personal. She approached his table with determined steps, stopping directly before him and placing a small leather-bound journal on the scarred wooden surface. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice steady despite the danger of addressing such a man. "I believe we have matters to discuss regarding my father's passing." Jeremiah's hand instinctively moved toward his holster, suspicion darkening his features. "I don't know you, lady," he growled, his voice rough from disuse and whiskey. "And I surely don't know your father." "Perhaps not by name," Eleanor replied, sliding into the chair opposite him without invitation, her posture straight and unflinching. But you knew him 15 years ago when he treated your wounds after the attack on your ranch. The words hit Jeremiah like a physical blow, memories he'd suppressed rising unbidden. My father never forgot you, she continued, lowering her voice. He documented everything those men did, the same men who now run this town as respectable citizens, the same men who poisoned him when he threatened to expose their crimes. She pushed the journal toward him, determination hardening her delicate features. I need your help to bring them to justice. For a long moment, Jeremiah stared at the journal. The past he'd tried to outrun finally catching up to him in this dusty saloon at the edge of civilization. His jaw tightened as he knocked back another whiskey, the amber liquid burning a familiar path down his throat. Justice died with my family, Miss Montgomery, he finally said, his voice barely audible above the piano music. All that's left is vengeance, and that's a burden you don't want to carry. Eleanor leaned forward, her eyes flashing with a fire that momentarily stunned the hardened outlaw. Call it what you will, Mr. Blackwood. These men took your family, and now they've taken mine. Our causes are aligned, whether you like it or not. Outside the saloon windows, the sun disappeared behind the distant mountains, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples as if the heavens themselves were aflame. Jeremiah found himself at a crossroads he never expected to face again. The choice between riding away from human connection as he'd done for 15 years, or standing his ground to face the men who had destroyed everything he loved. Eleanor watched him carefully, her hands folded calmly on the table, despite the dangerous man before her. I'll burn before I love again, he finally said, his voice low and threatening as he rose from the table. But I'll help you settle this score, for your father's sake. The following morning found Jeremiah restless, having spent the night in the town's small hotel rather than camping in the hills as he'd initially planned. Eleanor's revelation had changed everything, forcing him to delay meeting with his gang and reconsider his plan to rob the railroad payroll. He stood at the window of his rented room, watching as the town came to life below him, seeing it now through different eyes. Somewhere among these seemingly ordinary folk were the men responsible for destroying his life, men who had established themselves as pillars of this community while their hands remained stained with the blood of innocence. Jeremiah strapped on his gun belt and made his way to the local cafe, where Eleanor had arranged to meet him. She was already there, dressed more practically today in a simple blue dress and shawl, her copper hair pinned up beneath a modest hat. She looked up as he entered, her expression guarded but determined as he took the seat across from her. "Tell me everything," he demanded without preamble, his voice kept low to avoid the attention of the other patrons. Eleanor nodded, stirring her tea methodically as she began to explain how her father had pieced together the identities of the men responsible for the attack on the Blackwood Ranch 15 years earlier. "There are 3 of them," she explained quietly, sliding a folded paper across the table. "Franklin Mercer, the bank owner, Harold Sullivan, who now serves as mayor, and Judge William Preston, who ensures that no legal action ever threatens their interests." Jeremiah unfolded the paper, studying the names and the additional notes Eleanor had made regarding their daily habits and vulnerabilities. His fingers tightened on the paper as memories flooded back, the smell of burning wood, his wife's screams, his son's small body lying motionless in the dust. "Your father was certain?" he asked, his voice strained. Eleanor nodded solemnly. "He treated Mercer for a gunshot wound the same night of the attack, a wound you apparently inflicted before they overpowered you." Jeremiah's mind raced, calculating options and consequences as he had learned to do during his years as an outlaw. Simple revenge would be easy. He could kill all 3 men within a day and be across the territorial line by nightfall. But something in Eleanor's steady gaze made him pause. She wasn't seeking the blind vengeance that had consumed him for so long. She wanted justice, exposure, a reckoning that would cleanse this town rather than create more bloodshed. "What exactly are you proposing, Miss Montgomery?" he asked finally, folding the paper and tucking it inside his vest pocket. "These men have built their empire on stolen land and bloodshed," Eleanor replied, leaning forward slightly, her voice intense despite its softness. "They'd convinced everyone they're respectable citizens, but my father gathered evidence of their continued crimes, extortion, intimidation, even murder when necessary to protect their interests. That evidence is hidden in his office, but I can't access it alone." She paused, her green eyes searching his face. "I need someone they fear, someone whose very presence will distract them, while I retrieve the documents that will expose them to the territorial marshal when he arrives next week." As Jeremiah considered her proposal, the cafe door swung open, admitting a well-dressed man whose prosperous appearance marked him clearly as one of the town elite. Eleanor tensed almost imperceptibly, her hand tightening around her teacup as she nodded slightly toward the newcomer. "Mayor Sullivan," she murmured, her eyes lowered respectfully as the man noticed her and approached their table. Jeremiah watched through narrowed eyes as Sullivan tipped his hat to Eleanor, his gaze curious as it shifted to her companion. "Miss Montgomery, good morning," Sullivan said, his voice cordial though his eyes remained cold as they assessed Jeremiah. "I don't believe I've had the pleasure of meeting your friend." The hesitation before the word friend spoke volumes, as did the slight narrowing of the mayor's eyes as he studied Jeremiah's face more carefully. Jeremiah kept his expression neutral, though his right hand remained close to his holster beneath the table. "John Smith," he offered gruffly, deliberately avoiding a handshake. "Just passing through." Sullivan's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Redemption Creek welcomes all visitors, Mr. Smith, provided they respect our peaceful community." The threat beneath the polite words was unmistakable, and Jeremiah felt a familiar cold anger settling in his chest. This was one of the men who had murdered his family, standing before him playing the role of respected community leader. It took every ounce of self-control not to draw his revolver and end Sullivan's life right there in the cafe. Instead, he forced a tight smile. "I always respect peaceful communities, Mayor, especially ones run by such upstanding citizens." Sullivan's eyes hardened at the subtle emphasis, but his politician's smile remained fixed in place as he tipped his hat once more. "Enjoy your stay, Mr. Smith. Miss Montgomery, give my regards to your students." As Sullivan departed, Eleanor released a breath she'd been holding, her composure momentarily cracking to reveal the strain beneath. "He suspects something," she whispered, her fingers trembling slightly around her teacup. Jeremiah nodded, his gaze following Sullivan through the cafe window as the mayor made his way down the street toward the town hall. "Good," he replied quietly. "Let him suspect. Fear makes men careless, and careless men make mistakes." He turned back to Eleanor, seeing the concern etched on her face. "Tonight, we'll retrieve your father's evidence, and then we'll decide how these men will pay for what they've done." The day passed with excruciating slowness as Jeremiah familiarized himself with the layout of Redemption Creek. He noted the positions of the bank, the mayor's office, and the judge's house, constructing an internal map as he had done before countless robberies. But this time, His purpose was different. This wasn't about money or the thrill of outwitting the law. This was about confronting the past he'd fled for 15 years, about facing the men who had set him on his path of destruction. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the town, Jeremiah met Eleanor at the back door of her father's former medical office. She wore dark clothing and had her hair covered with a shawl, her face pale in the gathering darkness, but her expression resolute. "The office has been locked since his death," she explained quietly as she produced a key. "Mayor Sullivan wanted to claim my father's medical supplies for the town, but I insisted on time to sort through personal effects first." Jeremiah nodded, scanning the alleyway for any sign of observers before following her inside. The office smelled of medicinal herbs and dust, personal items still scattered about, as if the doctor had just stepped out momentarily instead of having been dead for over a week. Eleanor moved with purpose through the shadowed room, lighting a single lamp that cast a small circle of warm light. "My father kept his most important documents beneath a loose floorboard under his desk," she explained, kneeling and feeling along the wooden planks. Jeremiah stood guard by the window, watching the occasional passerby on the main street, his hand never straying far from his revolver. The silence between them was comfortable, filled with shared purpose rather than the awkward tension that usually existed between Jeremiah and anyone foolish enough to enter his orbit. "I've got it," Eleanor whispered after several tense minutes, excitement coloring her voice as she withdrew a oilskin packet from beneath the floorboard. She unwrapped it carefully on the desk, revealing a collection of letters, maps, and what appeared to be a legal document bearing the territorial seal. "This is it. Proof that Mercer, Sullivan, and Preston falsified land claims after the war, using their positions to steal property from returning soldiers and homesteaders." Her fingers traced the names listed on the document, stopping at one in particular. "Including your family's ranch, Mr. Blackwood." Jeremiah stared at the documents, emotions he'd suppressed for years threatening to overwhelm him. His family hadn't just been random victims of the lawlessness of the frontier. They had been specifically targeted as part of a calculated land grab orchestrated by men who now presented themselves as the pillars of civilization in this territory. The revelation stoked the embers of his hatred into a blinding rage that threatened to consume his carefully maintained control. His hand tightened around his revolver grip, the urge to hunt down these men immediately, nearly overwhelming his reason. Eleanor seemed to sense the dangerous turn of his thoughts, placing a gentle hand on his arm. The first person to touch him voluntarily in years. "We have the evidence now," she said softly, her green eyes seeking his in the lamplight. "We can bring them to justice through the law. Real justice, not just more bloodshed." Jeremiah looked down at her hand on his sleeve, then up at her face, finding something there he hadn't seen directed at him since before the war. Trust, and perhaps something deeper that he dared not name. "The law failed me once before," he replied, his voice rough with suppressed emotion. "What makes you think it will serve us now?" Before Eleanor could answer, the sound of approaching footsteps in the alley outside froze them both. Jeremiah extinguished the lamp with one quick movement, plunging the office into darkness as he drew his revolver. "Get down," he whispered, positioning himself between Eleanor and the door as the footsteps stopped outside. The door handle turned slowly, testing the lock, followed by a muffled voice that Jeremiah strained to hear. "Figured she'd come here eventually." The boss wants that office cleared out tonight, no matter what the lady says. Jeremiah recognized the voice as belonging to one of the men who had been watching them in the cafe earlier. Clearly one of Sullivan's lackeys. The lock rattled as something metal was inserted, attempting to pick it open. Jeremiah gestured for Eleanor to gather the documents as he prepared to confront the intruder. The door swung open, revealing the silhouette of a burly man who took 2 steps inside before Jeremiah's revolver pressed against his temple, stopping him cold. "Evening," Jeremiah drawled, his voice deadly calm in the darkness. "Seems you've lost your way." The intruder froze, his breathing shallow as he realized his predicament. "I'm just following orders," he stammered. Raising his hands slowly, "The mayor sent me to collect the doc's medical supplies for the town. Nothing personal." Jeremiah cocked his revolver, the sound unnaturally loud in the confined space. "Well, I'm giving you new orders. You're going to walk out of here and forget what you saw. And you're going to deliver a message to your boss. Tell Mayor Sullivan that John Smith is very interested in discussing old business with him and his partners." The man swallowed audibly, nodding with desperate eagerness. "Sure, mister. Whatever you say." As Jeremiah lowered his weapon slightly, the man's hand suddenly darted toward his own hidden pistol. Without hesitation, Jeremiah brought the butt of his revolver down hard on the man's temple, dropping him unconscious to the floor. "We need to move," he told Eleanor urgently, knowing that the confrontation had just accelerated their timeline. "Are those all the documents?" She nodded, quickly wrapping the papers and tucking them into her shawl. "Yes, everything that matters." Jeremiah checked the alley before guiding Eleanor out, leaving the unconscious man where he lay. "They'll know we have the evidence now," he said as they hurried through the shadows toward the relative safety of the boarding house, where Eleanor had taken a room after her father's death. "Sullivan will alert Mercer and the judge. By morning, they'll be looking to silence us both." Eleanor clutched the precious documents to her chest, her face determined in the moonlight that occasionally broke through the clouds. "Then we need to get these to somewhere safe until the marshal arrives." The boarding house was quiet when they slipped in through the back entrance, most of the occupants already retired for the night. Eleanor led Jeremiah to her small room, locking the door behind them as she lit a lamp. The space was neat but sparse, containing only a narrow bed, a washstand, and a small desk where students' papers were stacked neatly. Jeremiah stood awkwardly near the door, suddenly acutely aware of the impropriety of their situation. An unmarried woman alone in her room with a notorious outlaw. But propriety seemed a distant concern compared to survival. "We need to split up the documents," Eleanor said practically, spreading the papers on the desk. "If they catch one of us, the other might still get the evidence to the marshal." Jeremiah nodded, impressed by her clear-headed thinking despite the danger. As they sorted through the incriminating papers, their hands occasionally brushed, sending an unexpected jolt through Jeremiah's body, a reminder of how long it had been since he'd allowed himself any human connection. Eleanor paused, looking up at him with an expression he couldn't quite decipher in the lamplight. "Why did you really agree to help me, Mr. Blackwood?" she asked softly. The question caught him off guard, forcing him to consider motivations he deliberately avoided examining. "Your father saved my life," he replied after a moment, his voice low. "I owe him a debt." Eleanor studied him, her green eyes seeing more than he was comfortable with. "Is that the only reason?" she pressed gently. Jeremiah looked away, finding it difficult to meet her gaze. "What other reason would there be? I'm not the kind of man who helps people, Miss Montgomery. I'm the kind people warn their children about." Eleanor stepped closer, close enough that he could detect the faint scent of lavender that clung to her hair. "I think you're exactly the kind of man who helps people, Jeremiah Blackwood. You've just forgotten that part of yourself." The use of his first name, spoken with such quiet conviction, cracked something in the wall he'd built around his heart. For 15 years, he'd defined himself by what he'd lost and the vengeance he sought. The possibility that he might be something more, something better, was both terrifying and strangely exhilarating. The moment was shattered by the sound of shouting in the street below. Jeremiah moved to the window, carefully peering around the edge of the curtain to see a group of armed men gathered outside the boarding house, led by Mayor Sullivan himself. "They found us," he said grimly, turning back to Eleanor. "Sullivan's brought 6 men." He checked his revolver, counting the bullets with practiced efficiency. "Is there another way out of here?" Eleanor nodded, her face pale but composed. "The back stairs lead to the kitchen. From there, we can reach the stables behind the general store." Jeremiah made a quick decision, dividing the papers between them. "Take these to the church," he instructed, handing her the most damning documents. "The pastor there strikes me as an honest man. Ask him to hide you until morning." He tucked his share of the evidence inside his vest. "I'll create a distraction. Make them think we're both trying to flee town. With any luck, they'll follow me and leave you clear to reach the church." Eleanor clutched his arm, concern evident in her eyes. "That's too dangerous. They'll kill you if they catch you." A grim smile touched Jeremiah's lips. "People have been trying to kill me for 15 years, Miss Montgomery. I'm still here." He hesitated, then did something that surprised even himself. He reached out and briefly touched her cheek with calloused fingers. "Be careful. This isn't your fight alone anymore." The tenderness of the gesture seemed to startle them both, and for a heartbeat, time suspended as their eyes met in the dim lamplight. Then the moment passed, reality reasserting itself, as heavy footsteps sounded on the stairs outside. Jeremiah moved to the door, gun drawn. "Count to 30, then take the back stairs. Don't stop for anything." Eleanor nodded, gathering her courage visibly. "Jeremiah," she said softly, using his given name again in a way that seemed to bridge the vast distance between their worlds. "Promise me you'll be careful too." He didn't answer, knowing better than to make promises he might not be able to keep. Instead, he slipped out into the hallway, closing the door firmly behind him before making his way toward the front of the boarding house, where Sullivan and his men were now pounding on the main entrance. The boarding house keeper, a nervous man in a nightshirt, was attempting to reason with the armed group as Jeremiah appeared at the top of the main staircase. "Evening, gentlemen," he called down, his voice carrying easily over the commotion. "Looking for someone?" All eyes turned upward, guns raising instinctively as Sullivan stepped forward, his politician's mask discarded to reveal the cold-eyed killer beneath. "Blackwood," he spat, recognition and hatred mingling in his voice. "I knew I'd seen your face before. Where's the Montgomery woman?" Jeremiah descended a few steps, keeping his movements casual, despite the multiple weapons aimed at him. "Miss Montgomery is no concern of yours anymore," he replied coolly. "Neither are the documents proving how you and your friends murdered my family and stole my land." Sullivan's face contorted with rage, but something else flickered in his eyes: fear. "Kill him!" he ordered his men, reaching for his own pistol. Jeremiah was faster, firing twice in rapid succession, hitting Sullivan in the shoulder and sending the other men diving for cover as he ducked behind the solid wooden banister. Chaos erupted in the boarding house as guests emerged from their rooms in alarm, providing the perfect distraction as Jeremiah fired again, deliberately aiming to create panic rather than casualties. He worked his way down the stairs in the confusion, using the frightened civilians as unwitting shields while making for the front door. A bullet splintered the wood near his head as one of Sullivan's men recovered enough to take aim. But Jeremiah didn't slow, bursting through the front door into the street and sprinting toward the livery stable where he'd left his horse. Shouts followed him, along with more gunfire that kicked up dust at his heels. Jeremiah zigzagged through the darkened streets, hoping that Eleanor had made it safely out the back while the attention was focused on him. He reached the livery, finding his gray stallion alert and ready, as if sensing his master's urgency. Within moments, he was mounted and bursting from the stable at a gallop, heading not out of town as his pursuers might expect, but toward the bank owned by Franklin Mercer, the man who had orchestrated the destruction of his life. The bank stood dark and silent on the corner of the main street, its imposing facade a testament to the wealth Mercer had accumulated through his illicit schemes. Jeremiah dismounted behind the building, tying his horse to a hitching post before examining the rear entrance. As an experienced bank robber, he knew the vulnerabilities of such establishments intimately. The lock posed little challenge to his practiced hands, and within minutes he was inside, moving silently through the darkened interior toward Mercer's private office. He found what he was looking for in a large safe concealed behind a painting. Not just cash and bonds, but ledgers detailing years of fraudulent transactions, extortion payments, and property seizures. Adding these to the documents Eleanor had entrusted to him, Jeremiah now possessed a complete record of the criminal enterprise that had claimed so many lives, including those of his wife and son. He was about to leave when a sound at the office door made him whirl around, gun raised. Franklin Mercer stood in the doorway, a shotgun aimed steadily at Jeremiah's chest. "I always knew you'd come back someday, Blackwood," Mercer said, his voice surprisingly calm for a man facing the outlaw he'd wronged so grievously. 15 years I've been looking over my shoulder, waiting for you to return." Jeremiah stood motionless, weighing his options as Mercer continued. "I should have made sure you were dead that night, along with your pretty wife and boy. My mistake." The casual cruelty of the words stoked the familiar rage in Jeremiah's heart. But he controlled it, knowing that blind anger would only get him killed now. "You've been living on borrowed time, Mercer," he replied evenly. "You and Sullivan and Preston." Mercer's laugh was bitter. "And what exactly do you think you're going to do, Blackwood? You're a wanted man in 3 territories. No one will take your word over ours. Documents or no documents." He gestured with the shotgun. "Put the ledgers down and step away from the safe." Instead, Jeremiah slowly tucked the ledgers more securely inside his coat. "I'm not the same frightened rancher you left for dead 15 years ago, Mercer. I've become something far more dangerous." His voice was eerily calm, the voice of a man who had nothing left to lose. "The question is, are you ready to face that?" For a tense moment, the two men stared at each other across the darkened office, decades of hatred condensed into a single confrontation. Then Mercer's finger tightened on the trigger, just as Jeremiah dove to the side, the shotgun blast deafening in the confined space. Jeremiah rolled behind the heavy desk as Mercer fumbled to reload, coming up with his Colt already aimed. His first shot caught Mercer in the chest, driving him backward against the wall. The banker slid slowly to the floor, the unfired shotgun slipping from nerveless fingers as his life's blood spread across his expensive waistcoat. Mercer looked up at Jeremiah with fading surprise as the outlaw approached cautiously. revolver still trained on him. "You actually did it," he gasped, blood bubbling at the corner of his mouth. "Waited all these years?" Jeremiah stood over him, feeling not the satisfaction he had expected, but a hollow emptiness as he watched his enemy's life ebbing away. "I want you to know something before you die, Mercer," he said quietly. "My family will have justice, not just vengeance. Everything you built with their blood will be torn down, and your name will be remembered only for your crimes." As the light faded from Mercer's eyes, Jeremiah heard shouts and pounding footsteps approaching the bank. Sullivan's men had figured out where he'd gone. Gathering the incriminating ledgers, Jeremiah slipped out through the back door, mounting his horse and disappearing into the night just as the first of the pursuers burst into the bank. His plan had worked. With Mercer dead and Sullivan wounded, only Judge Preston remained of the triumvirate that had destroyed his life. And more importantly, the attention of the entire town was focused on him, leaving Eleanor free to reach safety with her share of the evidence. The church stood on a small hill at the edge of town, its white steeple visible in the moonlight as Jeremiah approached cautiously several hours later. He had led his pursuers on a lengthy chase before doubling back, confident that they would be searching the trails leading out of town rather than suspecting he would return. Tying his horse in a grove of trees nearby, he made his way silently to the church's side entrance, knocking softly in a pattern he and Eleanor had agreed upon earlier. The door opened just enough to admit him, Eleanor's relieved face visible in the dim light of a single candle. "Thank God," she whispered, closing and bolting the door behind him. "I feared they'd killed you." The church was silent and empty save for the pastor, an elderly man who stood nearby with a determined expression that suggested he was prepared to defend his sanctuary if necessary. Jeremiah nodded respectfully to him before turning back to Eleanor. "Mercer is dead," he said without preamble. "Sullivan is wounded but alive, and I have this." He withdrew the bank ledgers from inside his coat, adding them to the pile of documents already spread out on a table near the altar. The pastor stepped forward, examining the additional evidence with a grave expression. "These confirm everything Miss Montgomery has told me," he said, his voice carrying the weight of moral authority. "The territorial marshal must see these immediately." Jeremiah agreed, though a part of him still doubted whether justice through legal channels was possible in a frontier where money and power often trumped law. "The marshal isn't due for another 3 days," he reminded them. By then, Sullivan and Preston could have fled or destroyed any remaining evidence. Eleanor's face was resolved in the candlelight as she gathered the documents together. "Then we need to get these to the nearest federal office ourselves," she declared. "There's a telegraph office in Cottonwood Springs, a day's ride from here. We can send for federal marshals directly." The plan made sense, but Jeremiah hesitated, acutely aware of the danger such a journey would pose. "Sullivan's men will be watching every trail out of town," he pointed out, "and I'm not exactly inconspicuous company for a respectable schoolteacher." The pastor cleared his throat, offering a solution that had clearly been discussed before Jeremiah's arrival. "My brother drives the supply wagon to Cottonwood Springs twice weekly. He's leaving at dawn tomorrow, and there's room for Miss Montgomery to hide among the cargo." He looked meaningfully at Jeremiah. "You, sir, would be too easily recognized. But if you could provide a distraction?" The implication was clear. Jeremiah would need to draw attention away from the departing wagon, putting himself at risk to ensure Eleanor's safe passage. For a moment, Jeremiah considered refusing. He had the evidence he needed to confront Judge Preston, the last of his family's killers. He could end this himself, the way he had dealt with Mercer, and be across the border before anyone could stop him. But looking at Eleanor's determined face, he realized that her way offered something his path of vengeance never could: the possibility of true justice and perhaps even redemption. "I'll do it," he agreed finally, "but I'll need to deal with Preston before I go. He's too dangerous to leave in play while you're traveling with the evidence." The night passed slowly as they refined their plan, the pastor providing food and coffee while they worked. By unspoken agreement, Jeremiah and Eleanor found themselves alone in the church's small study as dawn approached, the final preparations made for the dangerous day ahead. "You should rest while you can," he told her, noting the fatigue evident in her face, despite her unwavering determination. Eleanor shook her head, moving to stand by the window where the first faint light of dawn was becoming visible on the horizon. "I keep thinking about my father," she said softly. "He spent years gathering this evidence, knowing the risk. He believed in justice, even when it seemed impossible." She turned to face Jeremiah, her green eyes searching his face. "What will you do when this is over? Continue with your outlaw ways?" The question was asked without judgment, merely curiosity about the path of the complex man before her. Jeremiah had been asking himself the same question throughout the night, finding no easy answer. "I've been running for so long. I'm not sure I know how to stop," he admitted, the honesty of his response surprising even himself. "The man I was before the war, before losing my family, he's long gone." Eleanor moved closer, her proximity causing his heart to beat faster in a way that had nothing to do with danger. "I don't believe that," she said quietly. "That man is still there, beneath all the pain and vengeance. I've seen him in how you've helped me, in how you chose justice over simply killing Sullivan when you had the chance." Jeremiah looked away, uncomfortable with her faith in a goodness he wasn't sure existed anymore. "I told you before, I'll burn before I love again." The words lacked the conviction they had held when he'd first uttered them in the saloon, that seemed so long ago now. Eleanor stepped closer still, close enough that he could feel the warmth of her breath when she spoke. "Some things are worth burning for, Jeremiah Blackwood." And then, with a courage that left him breathless, she reached up and touched his face, her fingers tracing the scar that ran along his jawline, a remnant of the attack that had taken everything from him. The moment stretched between them, filled with possibilities neither had dared consider before. Then the church bell rang, signaling the hour and breaking the spell. Jeremiah stepped back, returning to the practical matters at hand. "It's time," he said, checking his revolver one last time. "The supply wagon will be leaving soon, and I need to find Preston before he learns what happened to Mercer." Eleanor nodded, composed once more, though her eyes still held the warmth of the moment they had shared. "Be careful," she said simply, "and remember, this isn't just about vengeance anymore." As Jeremiah slipped out into the gray light of early dawn, her words echoed in. Judge William Preston's house stood apart from the town, a grand structure that proclaimed its owner's importance and wealth. Jeremiah approached cautiously, noting the absence of horses or carriages that might indicate the judge had already fled after learning of Mercer's death. The house appeared quiet, smoke rising lazily from one chimney in the cool morning air. Jeremiah circled to the rear entrance, finding it unlocked, an indication of the judge's confidence in his position, or perhaps his ignorance of the night's events. The kitchen was empty, though the remains of a solitary breakfast indicated the judge was indeed at home. Jeremiah moved silently through the house, revolver in hand, following the sound of movement to a study at the front of the house. There he found Preston, a distinguished man in his 60s, with silver hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to commanding respect. The judge was hurriedly packing documents into a leather case, his movements betraying an urgency that suggested news of Mercer's death had indeed reached him. "Going somewhere, Judge?" Jeremiah asked from the doorway, his revolver aimed steadily at the older man's chest. Preston froze, then slowly straightened, his aristocratic features composing themselves despite the fear evident in his eyes. "Blackwood," he acknowledged, his voice steady, despite the circumstances. "I wondered when you would come for me." He gestured toward a decanter on a nearby table. "May I offer you a drink before you kill me? It seems only civilized." The calm request, so at odds with the situation, momentarily threw Jeremiah off balance. This was not the reaction he had expected from a man facing the vengeful survivor of a family he had helped destroy. 15 years ago, you helped Mercer and Sullivan murder my family and steal my land, Jeremiah said, ignoring the offer. "I want to hear you admit it before I decide what happens next." Preston sighed, moving to pour himself a drink, despite Jeremiah's weapon trained on him. "What would you have me say? That I'm sorry? That I regret the decisions made by desperate men in desperate times?" He took a sip of whiskey, his hand remarkably steady. "The war had left the territory in chaos. We saw an opportunity to bring order, to build something lasting. Your land was simply necessary for our plans." The casual dismissal of his family's lives rekindled Jeremiah's rage, his finger tightening on the trigger. "Necessary?" he repeated, his voice dangerously soft. "My wife and 5-year-old son were necessary casualties?" Preston had the grace to look ashamed, briefly lowering his eyes. "That was regrettable. Mercer and Sullivan took matters further than I had anticipated. By the time I learned what they had done, it was too late to undo it." He raised his gaze to meet Jeremiah's once more. "So here we are, 15 years later. You've come for your revenge. I won't insult you by begging for my life." Jeremiah studied the man before him. Not a monster, but something perhaps more dangerous. A man who had justified atrocities in the name of progress and order. "I'm not here to kill you, Preston," he said finally, surprising himself as much as the judge. "I'm here to ensure you face justice for what you've done. The territorial marshal will receive all the evidence: Mercer's ledgers, Dr. Montgomery's journal, the falsified land claims. Your empire is finished." Preston's composed expression cracked slightly, genuine fear showing through for the first time. "You can't possibly believe they'll take the word of an outlaw over a territorial judge." "They'll believe the evidence," Jeremiah replied confidently, "and they'll believe Eleanor Montgomery, whose father you had murdered when he threatened to expose your crimes." He gestured with his revolver toward the case Preston had been packing. "Those documents you're so eager to hide, are they worth adding obstruction of justice to your crimes?" The judge hesitated, then slowly placed the case on the desk, surrendering to the inevitable. "What happens now?" he asked quietly, the fight gone out of him as he realized the extent of the evidence against him. Instead of answering, Jeremiah moved to the window, looking out at the town below as the morning activity increased. A wagon was rolling out along the main street, the supply wagon bound for Cottonwood Springs, with Eleanor hidden among its cargo. Right on schedule, a group of Sullivan's men appeared, heading toward the edge of town in pursuit of the false trail Jeremiah had laid during the night. Everything was proceeding according to plan. He turned back to Preston, who was watching him with a mixture of resignation and curiosity. "Now," Jeremiah said, holstering his weapon in a gesture that clearly surprised the judge, "you're going to help me create a distraction that ensures Miss Montgomery reaches Cottonwood Springs safely with the evidence." Preston's eyebrows rose in confusion. "You expect me to help secure my own downfall?" he asked incredulously. Jeremiah's smile was cold. "I expect you to choose between cooperating with me now or facing Sullivan's men alone when they discover you're trying to flee. Men like Sullivan don't leave loose ends, Judge, especially ones that could testify against them." The truth of this statement was evident in Preston's expression as he contemplated his limited options. "What kind of distraction did you have in mind?" he asked finally, practical self-preservation overcoming any loyalty to his former partners. Jeremiah outlined his plan quickly. Preston would publicly announce the discovery of new evidence implicating Sullivan in Mercer's death, causing the remaining conspirators to turn against each other, while Eleanor escaped with the real evidence that would condemn them all. The judge listened attentively, his legal mind finding the weaknesses in the plan, but also acknowledging its potential effectiveness. "It might work," he conceded when Jeremiah finished speaking. "But what guarantee do I have that you won't simply kill me once I've served my purpose?" Jeremiah considered the question honestly. A day earlier, he might have had every intention of doing exactly that. But something had changed during the long night in the church with Eleanor. A shift in priorities from personal vengeance to a broader justice. "No guarantees, Judge," he replied frankly. "But if you help ensure that Eleanor reaches the marshal safely with the evidence, I'll testify that you cooperated voluntarily. It might make a difference when sentencing comes around." Preston studied him for a long moment, perhaps recognizing the change that Jeremiah himself was only beginning to understand. "You're not what I expected, Blackwood," he said finally, setting down his empty glass. "Very well, I'll make your announcement, but not because I fear your bullet, because after 15 years of living with what we did to your family, perhaps it's time for this to end." The admission, so unexpected from a man Jeremiah had demonized for so long, left him momentarily speechless. The judge straightened his jacket, recovering something of his courtroom dignity. "Shall we proceed with our performance then? Sullivan's men will be returning to town soon when they realize they've been led on a wild goose chase." The town square was beginning to fill with the usual morning activity when Jeremiah and Preston emerged from the judge's house, walking side by side like old acquaintances rather than mortal enemies. Heads turned as they passed, the unlikely pairing drawing curious glances from townspeople already on edge after the violence of the previous night. They made their way to the town hall, where Preston ascended the steps with the authority of his office, calling for attention in a voice accustomed to commanding courtrooms. Within minutes, a crowd had gathered, including several of Sullivan's men who had returned from their fruitless search. "Citizens of Redemption Creek," Preston began, his oratory skills evident as he addressed the assembled crowd. "It is my solemn duty to inform you of disturbing evidence that has come to light regarding the death of our esteemed banker, Franklin Mercer." A murmur ran through the crowd at the confirmation of Mercer's death, news that had been spreading through town since dawn. Documents discovered in Mr. Mercer's possession indicate that he and Mayor Sullivan have been engaged in fraudulent business practices that have harmed many in this community. The judge's voice carried clearly across the square, his words causing exactly the stir Jeremiah had hoped for. From his position at the edge of the crowd, Jeremiah watched Sullivan's men exchange alarmed glances, one breaking away to presumably inform their wounded leader of this unexpected development. Preston continued his improvised speech, elaborating on fictional evidence with the conviction of a man who knew exactly what real evidence existed. As a result, I am temporarily assuming leadership of the town council until these serious allegations can be properly investigated by territorial authorities, he announced, effectively cutting Sullivan out of power in one bold stroke. The distraction was working perfectly. As attention focused on Preston's shocking announcements, Jeremiah slipped away from the crowd, making his way toward the livery stable where his horse waited. The supply wagon carrying Eleanor would be well on its way to Cottonwood Springs by now, and his part in town was finished. All that remained was to follow at a distance, ensuring no pursuit threatened her journey. As he saddled his gray stallion, Jeremiah found himself thinking not of the vengeance he had finally achieved, but of the green-eyed schoolteacher who had somehow awakened something in him he had thought long dead. The road to Cottonwood Springs wound through rugged country, crossing open prairies and threading between rocky outcroppings that provided perfect vantage points for anyone seeking to monitor the trail. Jeremiah rode cautiously, staying off the main road while keeping the supply wagon in distant sight. By midday, the wagon had made good progress without incident, stopping briefly at a creek to water the horses. From his position on a nearby ridge, Jeremiah watched through his spyglass as the pastor's brother checked the surrounding area before helping Eleanor emerge from her hiding place among the cargo to stretch her legs and drink from the creek. Even at this distance, the sight of her sent an unfamiliar warmth through Jeremiah's chest. Her copper hair caught the sunlight as she moved, and though he couldn't see her face clearly, he could imagine the determination in her green eyes as she prepared to continue their dangerous mission. He was about to lower the spyglass when movement farther down the trail caught his attention. Riders approaching from the direction of Redemption Creek, moving fast. Jeremiah counted 5 men, recognizing the lead rider as one of Sullivan's closest associates. Somehow they had discovered Eleanor's escape and the true nature of Preston's distraction. Jeremiah spurred his horse down the ridge, cutting across country to intercept the supply wagon before it continued into danger. He reached the creek just as Eleanor and the driver were preparing to depart, their alarm evident as he galloped up with his warning. "Sullivan's men are coming," he explained breathlessly, dismounting beside the wagon. 5 riders, heavily armed, less than a mile behind us. The driver, a grizzled man who resembled his pastor brother, cursed under his breath. "We can't outrun them in this wagon," he stated grimly, looking to Jeremiah for solutions. Eleanor's face paled slightly at the news, but her voice remained steady as she clutched the oilskin packet containing their evidence. "We have to reach Cottonwood Springs," she insisted. "Everything depends on it." Jeremiah nodded, his mind racing through possibilities, before settling on the only viable option. "Take my horse," he told Eleanor, already removing his saddlebags. "He's fast and sure-footed. You can reach Cottonwood Springs by nightfall if you push him." Eleanor shook her head vehemently. "I won't leave you here to face them alone." Jeremiah took her hands, his touch gentler than she had ever felt from him. "This was always the plan, Eleanor. Get the evidence to the marshal. Make sure justice is done." His eyes held hers, conveying what he couldn't bring himself to say aloud. "I've spent 15 years as a wanted man. A few more days won't matter." The driver interrupted their moment, pointing urgently down the trail. "They're coming. Whatever you're going to do, do it now." Jeremiah helped Eleanor mount his gray stallion, adjusting the stirrups for her smaller frame, while giving quick instructions on the horse's temperament. As she settled in the saddle, evidence secured inside her coat, Eleanor looked down at Jeremiah with emotions too complex for words. "I'll send help as soon as I reach town," she promised. Jeremiah nodded, knowing that even if help came, it might be too late. "Remember what I told you," he said quietly, so only she could hear. "I'll burn before I love again." A smile touched her lips, despite the danger surrounding them. "Some things are worth burning for," she replied, echoing her words from the church. Then, with a final look that contained both promise and farewell, she urged the stallion forward, galloping away from the creek toward Cottonwood Springs. Jeremiah watched her go, a strange peace settling over him, despite the approaching danger. He turned to the wagon driver, who was checking the shotgun he had produced from beneath his seat. "You should go too," Jeremiah suggested. "This isn't your fight." The older man chambered a shell with a definitive click. "My brother asked me to see Miss Montgomery safely to Cottonwood Springs. That's what I aim to do." His weathered face broke into a grin smile. "Besides, I've never much cared for Sullivan and his boys. Been waiting for a chance to express my opinion on their business practices." With a newfound respect for the deceptively ordinary-looking driver, Jeremiah took position behind the wagon, using it as cover as the riders appeared around the bend in the trail. They slowed upon seeing the wagon, apparently stopped for a rest, clearly expecting easy prey rather than armed resistance. Jeremiah's reputation must not have preceded him to this particular group, or they would have approached with far more caution. Their mistake gave him the advantage he needed, allowing him to take careful aim at the lead rider while they were still assessing the situation. His first shot took the leader from his saddle, creating instant confusion among the remaining riders. The driver's shotgun roared beside him, further scattering the attackers as they sought cover and returned fire. Bullets splintered the wooden wagon as Jeremiah methodically worked his way through his limited ammunition, each shot calculated for maximum effect. 2 more riders fell before the remaining pair retreated back down the trail, presumably to regroup and possibly summon reinforcements from town. "We've bought some time," Jeremiah told the driver, as they quickly reloaded their weapons. "But they'll be back, and with more men." The driver nodded grimly, climbing back onto the wagon seat. "Then we'd best not be here when they return." He gestured for Jeremiah to join him. "Miss Montgomery has a good head start now. We should keep moving toward Cottonwood Springs. Even if we don't make it all the way, we can lead these vermin away from her trail." The plan made sense, and Jeremiah found himself admiring the quiet courage of this unassuming man who had voluntarily joined what might well be a losing battle. They traveled steadily through the afternoon, stopping occasionally to set simple ambushes that further delayed their pursuers, without directly engaging the larger force that now followed them. By sunset, they had reached a narrow canyon that offered both danger and opportunity, a natural bottleneck where they could make a stand if necessary, but also a potential trap with no easy escape. The driver, who had finally introduced himself simply as Thomas, studied the terrain with the eye of a man who had spent his life traversing these lands. "There's a fork about half a mile ahead," he explained, pointing toward the canyon. "The right path leads to Cottonwood Springs. The left dead ends in a box canyon. Might be useful." Jeremiah understood immediately. "We take the left fork, make them think we're trapped," he suggested. "While they're busy with us, Eleanor reaches town safely." Thomas nodded, a grim smile on his weathered face. "Figure we can hold them off long enough." The marshal in Cottonwood Springs is a good man. Once Miss Montgomery gets there with that evidence, Sullivan's days are numbered. He looked at Jeremiah appraisingly. Course, our odds of walking away from this aren't what you'd call favorable. For the first time in 15 years, Jeremiah found himself contemplating death, not as a release from his burden of vengeance, but as a loss of something precious that had only just begun to take root. The possibility of a future, not one defined by his past wrongs, but by new beginnings, had seemed impossible just days ago. Now, with Eleanor's words echoing in his mind, he found himself reluctant. And I've got unfinished business waiting for me in Cottonwood Springs. Thomas laughed, a surprisingly warm sound in their dire circumstances. You mean that pretty schoolteacher? Been watching you two. Reminds me of how my Martha and I started out. Her all proper and educated. Me, rough as a cob. He flicked the reins, urging the tired horses forward into the gathering dusk. 40 years together before she passed last winter. Best 40 years a man could ask for. The simple testimony to love's endurance touched something deep in Jeremiah's hardened heart, offering a vision of possibilities he had denied himself for so long. They made their camp at the end of the Box Canyon as night fell completely, creating the illusion of a desperate last stand, while actually preparing a more cunning defense. Thomas knew the canyon well, pointing out a narrow trail that climbed the steep wall to a ledge above, an escape route if things became truly desperate. They built a fire larger than prudence would dictate, deliberately signaling their position to their pursuers, while setting up defensive positions among the boulders that littered the canyon floor. As they waited in the darkness beyond the fire's glow, Jeremiah found himself thinking of Eleanor, imagining her arrival in Cottonwood Springs, her presentation of the evidence to the marshal, the beginning of justice for his family after so many years. But more than that, he thought of her courage, her intelligence, her unwavering belief in doing what was right, regardless of the cost. In just a few days, she had awakened in him feelings he had sworn never to experience again after the devastating loss of his first family. "I'll burn before I love again," he had told her. Perhaps burning wasn't always destruction. Sometimes it was transformation, a phoenix-like rebirth from the ashes of what had been lost. The distant sound of approaching riders broke into his thoughts, bringing him back to the immediate danger. Thomas extinguished their fire with a swift kick of dirt, plunging the canyon into darkness, illuminated only by the faint light of stars and a quarter moon. "Showtime," the older man whispered, taking position behind a large boulder with his shotgun. Jeremiah checked his revolver one last time, counting the precious bullets. 6 in the chamber, 12 more in his belt, against what sounded like at least a dozen riders. The odds were indeed unfavorable, but he had faced worse and survived. This time, he had something worth surviving for. The confrontation began with an exchange of gunfire, bullets ricocheting off rocks as Sullivan's men attempted to flush them out from their defensive positions. Jeremiah and Thomas responded judiciously, making each shot count while creating the impression of a desperate last stand. As the night wore on, the attackers grew bolder, advancing deeper into the canyon under cover of darkness. Jeremiah allowed himself to be glimpsed occasionally, drawing fire while Thomas repositioned, the two men working in surprising harmony despite their brief acquaintance. By midnight, it was clear that their ammunition would not last until dawn. "Time for Plan B," Thomas muttered as they crouched behind a boulder, bullets whining overhead. "The escape trail. If we slip out now, We might make it to Cottonwood Springs by morning." Jeremiah hesitated, knowing that leaving their position would likely allow Sullivan's men to discover they'd been led into a trap, potentially sending riders back toward the main trail where they might intercept Eleanor if she had been delayed for any reason. "You go," he told Thomas firmly. "I'll stay and keep them occupied until dawn. By then, Eleanor will have reached the marshal for certain." Thomas studied him in the darkness, understanding the sacrifice being offered. "You sure about this, Blackwood? Seems to me that schoolteacher might appreciate you arriving in one piece." Despite the gravity of their situation, Jeremiah found himself smiling at the thought. "Tell her," he began, then shook his head. "Just make sure she knows I didn't break my promise. I'll be right behind you." It was a lie they both recognized, but Thomas nodded anyway, respecting a man's right to choose his own ending. "Been an honor riding with you," he said simply, extending his hand. Jeremiah shook it firmly, a gesture of respect between men who had become unlikely allies. As Thomas disappeared into the darkness toward the escape trail, Jeremiah prepared for his last stand. He distributed his remaining ammunition among strategic positions, creating the illusion of multiple defenders still holding the canyon. Then he began moving between these positions, firing from one location before quickly shifting to another, confusing the attackers about how many opponents they faced. It was a strategy that could only work for so long, but if it bought Thomas enough time to reach safety and join Eleanor, it would be worth it. Dawn was breaking, pale light creeping into the canyon, when Jeremiah fired his last bullet. Sullivan's men had grown cautious during the night, maintaining their distance after several of their number had fallen to his accurate shooting. But now, as silence followed their latest volley, they began to advance more boldly. Jeremiah drew his hunting knife, his final weapon, and prepared to sell his life as dearly as possible. He had always expected to die violently, had even welcomed the prospect during his darkest days. But now, with the possibility of a different future tantalizingly close, he found himself regretting that he would not see Eleanor again, would not have the chance to explore the connection that had formed between them in such a short time. As Sullivan's men closed in on his position, weapons ready, Jeremiah thought again of Eleanor's words. Some things are worth burning for. He had spent 15 years consumed by the cold fire of vengeance, but in the past few days, he had felt the warmer flames of connection, purpose, and perhaps even love beginning to rekindle in his heart. If this was to be his end, at least he would die as a man reclaiming his humanity, rather than the empty shell of an outlaw he had been for so long. He tightened his grip on his knife, preparing to emerge from cover and face his attackers. The crack of a rifle shot echoed through the canyon, but it came not from Sullivan's men, but from the rim above. More shots followed in quick succession, precise and devastating, as the attackers suddenly found themselves caught in a crossfire from above. Jeremiah peered cautiously around his boulder to see riders on the canyon rim, not Sullivan's reinforcements, but men wearing the unmistakable badges of U.S. Marshals. Among them, mounted on his own gray stallion, was Eleanor, her copper hair catching the first rays of sunrise as she directed the lawmen to Sullivan's retreating men. Disbelief and hope warred in Jeremiah's chest as he emerged slowly from his position, hands raised to identify himself to the marshals. The firefight ended quickly, Sullivan's men surrendering or fleeing in the face of federal authority. As the marshals rounded up the survivors, Eleanor guided her horse down a trail to the canyon floor. Dismounting when she reached Jeremiah, she stood before him, her green eyes taking in his exhausted, dust-covered appearance, the blood staining his sleeve from a bullet graze, the knife still clutched in his hand. "You're alive," she said simply, her voice trembling slightly with emotions too complex to name. Jeremiah nodded, still unable to fully comprehend his unexpected salvation. Thomas made it through, he surmised, glancing up at the marshals, still positioned on the rim. Eleanor nodded. He reached Cottonwood Springs just after I did. The marshal already had a telegram from the territorial governor ordering Sullivan's arrest based on Judge Preston's testimony. She stepped closer, close enough that he could see the fatigue in her face, the determination that had driven her through the night. "Preston confessed everything after you left town. It seems you made quite an impression on him." Jeremiah absorbed this information slowly, the realization dawning that his 15-year quest for vengeance had transformed, in its final hours, into something else entirely. Justice, not just for his family, but for all those who had suffered under the triumvirate's corrupt rule. "It's over then," he said quietly, the weight of those words settling around him like a physical presence. Eleanor nodded again, her eyes never leaving his face. "Sullivan is in custody. The evidence has been secured. Your family will have justice at last." She hesitated before adding softly, "The marshal knows who you are, Jeremiah. He knows everything." The implication was clear. His identity as a wanted outlaw was no longer a secret from the law. Jeremiah had expected nothing less, had been prepared to pay the price for his years outside the law once his family's killers were brought to justice. "I suppose I'll be joining Sullivan in custody then," he remarked with resignation, already imagining the jail cell that awaited him. To his surprise, Eleanor smiled, a small, secretive smile that held more hope than he had dared to feel in years. "The marshal is also aware of your role in exposing this conspiracy," she explained, "and of certain, extenuating circumstances surrounding your past crimes." She reached into her pocket, withdrawing an official-looking document. "This is a conditional pardon from the territorial governor, authorized by telegram pending your testimony against Sullivan and his associates. It doesn't erase the past, but it offers a future if you want it." Jeremiah stared at the document, unable to comprehend the second chance being offered to him after so many years of believing himself beyond redemption. "Why would they do this for me?" he asked, genuinely baffled by the turn of events. Eleanor's smile deepened as she placed the pardon in his hands. "Because I convinced them that the man you were before the war, before losing your family, he's still there, and that man deserves a chance to live again." Her words echoed their conversation in the church study, reminding him of the connection that had formed between them in the midst of danger and shared purpose. She stepped closer still, her hand coming to rest lightly on his arm. "The question is, Jeremiah Blackwood, do you still believe you'll burn before you love again?" The weight of 15 years of solitude and vengeance seemed to lift from Jeremiah's shoulders as he looked into Eleanor's eyes, seeing there not just the present moment, but possibilities that stretched into a future he had never allowed himself to imagine. The burning he had feared wasn't destruction after all, but the warmth of connection, of purpose beyond revenge, of belonging somewhere after so long adrift. "Some things," he said softly, echoing her words back to her as his hand tentatively reached up to touch her cheek, "are worth burning for." As the sun rose fully over the canyon, painting the stone walls in gold and amber, Jeremiah Blackwood embraced not just Eleanor Montgomery, but the second chance at life he had never thought possible. The outlaw who had sworn to burn before loving again found himself willingly engulfed in the transformative flames of redemption, belonging, and a love that had changed his fate forever. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left.